The 4th of July. It's supposed to be the great American equalizer. We all look up at the same sky. We all celebrate the very concept of freedom. But the late hours of Independence Day, 1999, the air inside the infantry barracks at Fort Campbell, Kentucky was thick, not just with the suffocating humidity of the Mid-South summer, but with something more toxic. It was an era defined by a single crushing mandate: don't ask, don't tell. It was a policy that promised privacy, but in practice, it bred a culture of paranoia, whispers, and witch hunts. Private First Class Barry Winchell was an exemplary soldier. He was 21 years old, a squared away infantryman who just wanted to fly helicopters. To escape the stifling heat of his own room and the relentless, agonizing psychological torment from his own roommate, Barry pulled a canvas cot out onto the concrete walkway outside his own door to sleep. He thought he was safe on an American military installation. He thought the fight was over. But while the rest of the country was sweeping up the ashes from their sparklers and sleeping off the celebrations of freedom, a fellow soldier was walking down the dimly lit hallway. He was gripping a Louisville Slugger, fueled by hours of targeted, hateful goading, and preparing to commit an act of ultimate betrayal. Welcome back to Homocidal Tendency. I'm your host, Matt. Before we step back into the dark today, I have a little bit of housekeeping. First off, thank you so much for all the support over the last few months. And make sure you're subscribed wherever you get your podcasts. And if you have a second, leave a 5-star rating and review. It really helps the show find new listeners. You can also follow along on our social media pages for visual dives and episode updates. You can find us on most social media at Homocidal Tendency. Depending on where you're listening to this, you're likely gearing up for or right in the middle of the 4th of July weekend. It's a time for cookouts, it's a long weekend, and there's always fireworks. But as true crime has taught us time and time again, monsters, they don't take holidays off. At the time of the release of this episode, we're marking the anniversary of the case we're about to talk about. It's incredibly important that we remember this story right now, this weekend. Because while the rest of the country was celebrating freedom and independence in the summer of 1999, a young man who had volunteered to defend those very freedoms was being haunted in his own home. This just isn't a story about a murder. It's a story about a system that looked the other way, a toxic culture of forced silence, and a tragedy that unfolded while the fireworks were going off overhead. And let me just say in advance, this is an incredibly rough one. Like, writing and researching this episode, I had to fight back tears. It's a rough one. I can't say it enough. So if my voice is a little more somber than usual, I apologize. Just we'll have to get through it together. All right, let's get into it. The devastating case of Private First Class Barry Winchell. When we talk about true crime, it's dangerously easy to reduce a victim to the worst thing that's ever happened to them. But to understand the sheer tragedy of what went down at Fort Campbell, you have to understand who Barry Winchell was before he ever laced up a pair of combat boots. Here's the foundation of the story. Barry was born in 1977 and raised in Missouri. His parents, Patricia and Wally Cuddles, have always been very clear when speaking about him. They never wanted to canonize Barry or paint him as a flawless saint. He had his moments, just like any teenager. But at his core, he was incredibly caring, fiercely compassionate, and naturally outgoing. If you had met Barry in high school, you probably wouldn't have immediately pegged him for an infantryman. He was the kind of kid who lived out loud. He spent his teenage years playing in a local rock band. He rocked long hair and fully embraced his rebellious side, complete with a large tattoo of an eyeball on the right side of his chest. He was expressive, artistic, and completely comfortable in his own skin. But underneath that rock and roll exterior, Barry had found a profound sense of duty. The military wasn't just a backup plan for him, it was a deep rooted family legacy. His grandfather had served in the Navy during World War II, two of his uncles were Marines, and both his father and his older brother had served in the Army. Barry grew up steeped in that culture of service and brotherhood. By the time he was a teenager, he already knew his path. Right after high school, Barry made the pivot. He cut the long hair, stepped away from the band, and enlisted in the United States Army. He was eventually signed to the 2nd Battalion, 502nd Infantry Regiment of the famed 101st Airborne Division, also known as the Screaming Eagles. He was stationed at Fort Campbell in Kentucky. And Barry wasn't just looking for a standard tour of duty. He gravitated towards the hardest, most dangerous jobs available. When he first enlisted, his absolute dream was to become a military underwater welder. It's a grueling, highly specialized field, but after surviving the physical and mental gauntlet of the Army boot camp, he set his sights even higher. He realized his true ambition was in aviation, and he began laying the groundwork to become an Army helicopter pilot. He was thriving. By all accounts, Private First Class Winchell was a squared-away soldier. He was the kind of guy that took care of his squad mates and did exactly what was asked of him. But Barry enlisted in 1997. He stepped into a military strictly governed by the don't ask, don't tell policy. It was an environment that demanded absolute conformity. When rumors were weaponized and any deviation from the barracks' hyper-masculinity put a target on your back. Barry was an exemplary soldier, but he was living in a pressure cooker. Fort Campbell sits right on the Kentucky-Tennessee border. It's massive, rigid, and isolated. But if you drove just about an hour south down I-24, you hit Nashville. For the soldiers stuck in the suffocating routine of the base life, Nashville was the ultimate weekend escape hatch. In early 1999, Barry's roommate, Justin Fisher, suggested they make the drive down for a night out. And this detail is crucial because it forms the twisted psychological foundation for everything that happens later. Fisher didn't just suggest going to a standard dive bar, he specifically brought Barry to a place called The Connection. At the time, The Connection was a massive, vibrant, neon-soaked epicenter of Nashville's gay and drag nightlife. It was a massive club featuring multiple dance floors, theater seating, and a cast of incredible performers. Why Fisher, a soldier who would later weaponize homophobia to orchestrate a murder, was frequenting a gay club is a massive contradiction that we'll have to unpack later. But that night, Fisher was the guy. He was the one that was navigating the space, and he was the one that introduced Barry to the woman who would change his life. Her name was Calpernia Addams. Calpernia was a stunning transgender showgirl who performed regularly at The Connection. But beyond the glamour and beyond the stage lights, she and Barry shared an immediate, unspoken common ground. Before she transitioned and became a performer, Calpernia had served as a combat medic, a Navy hospital corpsman attached to the Marines. She understood the military machine. She understood the language, the stress, and the culture Barry was living in every single day. When Fisher introduced them, Barry was instantly captivated. For a guy like Barry, who's outgoing, deeply compassionate, and stifled by the hypermasculinity of the infantry, meeting Calpernia was like taking a full, fresh breath of air. It wasn't scandalous, and it wasn't a secret underground transaction. It was just a classic, simple meet cute. A guy went to a club, saw a beautiful girl, struck up a conversation, and they just clicked. If you look at the media coverage immediately following the murder, a lot of the outlets tried to sensationalize their relationship. They used words like illicit, secretive, or taboo. But when you actually listen to Calpernia talk about their time together, the most striking thing about their romance was just how breathtakingly normal it was. Calpernia was initially hesitant. She was a former military medic. She knew exactly what the climate was like under Don't Ask, Don't Tell. She knew the terrifying risk a young active duty infantryman was taking just being seen with a transgender woman in 1999. She tried to keep him at arm's length at first, warning him about what could happen to his career if his commanders found out. But Barry simply didn't care. He wasn't interested in the politics or the stigma. He just liked her. He was incredibly sweet and fiercely persistent. He would drive the hour down I-24 from Fort Campbell to Nashville every single weekend he had off. He brought her flowers, he took her out on actual dates. They would go to dinners, catch a movie, or just spend hours hanging out at her apartment, talking and cooking. For Barry, Nashville became a sanctuary. When he was with Calpernia, he didn't have to be the tough, hardened infantryman, perfectly conforming to the Army's rigid expectations. He could just be a 21-year-old kid from Missouri who was falling in love. She provided a safe harbor where he could be gentle, expressive, and completely himself. They built this beautiful, quiet life together over the course of a few months. But that sanctuary had a strict time limit. Every Sunday night, Barry had to get back into his car, drive north across the Kentucky state line, and step back onto Fort Campbell. He had to put the uniform back on, he had to lock away the man he was in Nashville, and step back into the barracks. And waiting in those barracks was a rumor mill that was already starting to spin out of control. Because Justin Fisher hadn't just introduced them and walked away, he was watching. And that beautiful, normal romance was about to become the target of a deeply toxic obsession. To understand how a quiet romance turned into a brutal murder, you have to look closely at the architect of the chaos, Justin Fisher. Fisher is the psychological black hole of this entire case. He was Barry's roommate, and on paper, they were peers. But in reality, Fisher was deeply erratic, highly manipulative, and possessed a vindictive streak that would terrify the people around him. The supreme, twisted irony of this entire tragedy is that, like we said, Fisher was the one that brought Barry to the connection. He was the one that introduced Barry to Calpernia. Fisher was a known regular at Nashville's gay clubs. He navigated those spaces comfortably. Yet, within the hyper-masculine walls of Fort Campbell, he projected the image of a hardened, untouchable infantryman. So, what changed? Why did the guy who played Wingman suddenly turn into a monster? Those closest to the case, including Calpernia herself, have pointed to a deeply toxic, obsessive jealousy. When Barry and Calpernia actually fell for each other, when it became real, a loving relationship, Fisher was suddenly locked out. Some speculate Fisher was secretly attracted to Barry and was furious at being rejected. Others believe he was simply a narcissistic manipulator who couldn't stand losing control over his roommate. Whatever the root cause, Fisher's jealousy quickly mutated into a calculated campaign of psychological warfare, and he knew exactly which weapon to use. In 1999, the military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy was the perfect shield for a sociopath. The policy literally mandated silence. Fisher knew that if he started spreading rumors about Barry's sexuality, Barry's hands were completely tied. Fisher started whispering to the other soldiers. He called Barry a faggot. His words, not mine. He told everyone in the unit about Calpernia, twisting a beautiful relationship into a grotesque barracks joke. He turned the tight-knit infantry squad against one of their own. The harassment became relentless. It was every day. Snide comments, aggressive posturing, and isolation. And Barry was indeed trapped. Under the rules of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, if a soldier was being harassed for being gay, they couldn't just go to their commanding officer and report the bullying, because the moment Barry filed a complaint, the military command wouldn't just investigate the bully, they would investigate Barry. They would demand to know if the rumors are true. And if they found out about Calpernia, Barry would be dishonorably discharged, stripped away from his dreams of flying, and totally running his life. Fisher knew this. He knew he had built a cage that Barry couldn't fight his way out of. To really grasp how a situation escalates into murder, you have to understand the ecosystem where it breathes. Fort Campbell in the summer of 1999 was a pressure cooker. This is the home of the 101st Airborne Division of the Infantry. These are the guys whose entire existence revolves around combat readiness. They're trained to be aggressive, unyielding, and above all, fiercely loyal to their unit. The military breaks you down just to build you back up as a single, cohesive weapon. But that cohesion was incredibly fragile because it relied on absolute conformity. Physically, the barracks offered zero escape. We're talking about cramped, cinder block rooms with no air conditioning during the suffocating heat of the Kentucky summer. You lived on top of each other, you ate together, trained together, and slept a few feet apart. There was no privacy. Every conversation was overheard, every action was scrutinized, and psychologically, the environment was infinitely more claustrophobic. This was the height of the Don't Ask, Don't Tell era. When President Clinton signed the policy in law in 1993, it was pitched as a compromise. The government essentially said, we won't ask if you're gay as long as you keep it a secret. But in practice, especially in a hyper-masculine infantry battalion, it didn't create a culture of privacy. It created paranoia. Don't ask, don't tell weaponized paranoia. It turned soldiers into informants. In the barracks, casual homophobia wasn't just common, it was a bonding mechanism. Using slurs and mocking anything perceived as weak or feminine was how you prove you belonged to the pack. If you didn't laugh at the jokes, if you didn't participate in the hyper-masculine posturing, you drew suspicion. And suspicion was dangerous. All it took was one rumor, one anonymous tip to a commanding officer, and your entire career was over. You would be interrogated, humiliated, and handed a dishonorable discharge. This was the air that Barry Winchell had to breathe every single day. He was the guy that liked poetry. He had a sensitive side. And he was quietly falling in love with a transgender woman an hour away in Nashville. He had to pack all that humanity into a rigid, emotionless box the second he stepped back onto the base. When Justin Fisher brought the secret of Calpernia Addams back across the Kentucky state line, he didn't just casually gossip. He launched a calculated, psychological siege against Barry. Fisher knew exactly the buttons to push in the infantry barracks. He started whispering to the other men in their platoon, twisting Barry's relationships into something for the unit to ridicule. He told them that Barry was dating a transgender woman, but he framed it in the most grotesque, derogatory terms possible to deliberately disgust the hypermasculine soldiers around them. Almost overnight, the environment around Barry curdled. The harassment wasn't subtle, and it wasn't an isolated incident. It was an everyday reality. Barry couldn't walk down the hall without hearing homophobic slurs thrown at his back. Fisher spearheaded the abuse, constantly calling him a faggot and queer in front of the other men. He made sure Barry was isolated, turning the tight-knit brotherhood of the squad into a hostile audience. Imagine that reality. You live, eat, and sleep in a room with the architect of your own torment. There's no door to lock, there's no retreat. But the most damning part of this entire tragedy isn't just what Fisher did, it's what the chain of command didn't do. In the Army, NCOs, or non-commissioned officers, the sergeants, they're supposed to be the front line of discipline and order. They are supposed to protect their men. But at Fort Campbell, the NCOs failed Barry Winchell on every conceivable level. The harassment was happening out in open. It was loud, it was constant. But the leadership brushed it off as standard barracks hazing. Worse, some reports and later investigations indicated that certain NCOs even joined in on the jokes. At one point, the stress of the constant bullying became so visible that Barry's superiors ordered him to undergo a psychological evaluation. And let's think about the absolute nightmare of that moment. Barry is sitting in front of an Army psychiatrist, visibly deteriorating from the stress of being relentlessly targeted by his own platoon. The doctor asks him, "What's wrong?" but Barry can't tell him because of the don't ask, don't tell policy. If Barry admits that he's being harassed for his sexuality, or if he mentions Calpernia to explain why the rumor started, he's legally confessing to a violation of military law. The doctor would be obligated to report him. The victim would become the suspect, and Barry would be dishonorably discharged. So Barry swallowed it. He sat in his chair, stayed quiet, and went right back to the barracks to face his abusers. He had no backup. He couldn't call for help. Fisher realized that Barry wasn't going to break, and the command wasn't going to intervene. The psychological torture wasn't working. Fisher wanted more. He wanted violence. But Justin Fisher was a coward. He didn't want to throw the punch himself. He needed a proxy. He needed a weapon. And sitting right there in the barracks was an 18-year-old kid named Calvin Glover, who was practically begging for someone to aim him. Private Calvin Glover was the exact opposite of Barry Winchell. Where Barry was quiet, physically capable, and focused on his future, Glover was an 18-year-old kid from a small town in Oklahoma who was drowning in his own insecurity. Glover was what you might call a barracks liability. He was a heavy blackout drinker who used alcohol to mask a deep, fragile desperation to be accepted. He was constantly trying to prove his toughness to the older guys, but it almost always backfired. He usually just ended up looking reckless and pathetic. The other men in the unit didn't respect him. They actually openly mocked him. But Justin Fisher didn't mock him. Fisher looked at this insecure, volatile teenager and saw a loaded weapon. By the first week of July in 1999, the heat inside the Fort Campbell barracks was literally and figuratively boiling over. It was the 4th of July weekend. The base was in standout mode, which meant no training, no duties, just a bunch of bored, stressed out, heavily armed young men with an endless supply of cheap beer and nowhere to go. On July 3rd, the unit threw a massive cake party right there in the barracks. Everyone was drinking, but Glover was completely unhinged. He was stumbling around, aggressively posturing, picking fights. Eventually, his blurry, drunken sights locked on Barry. Glover got in Barry's face and challenged him. But remember, Barry kept himself in incredible shape. He wasn't going to be bullied by an 18-year-old kid. When Glover swung on Barry didn't just defend himself, he completely physically dismantled him. Barry put Glover in a chokehold, took him to the ground, and pinned him there until the fight was completely drained out of him. For Glover, it was the ultimate public humiliation. He had tried to assert his dominance in front of the exact men whose respect he was desperately craving, and he had been effortlessly swatted down. This is the moment Justin Fisher had been waiting for. Throughout the entire day on July 4th, as soldiers dragged themselves out of bed and fireworks began to pop in the distance, Fisher refused to let the fight go. He cornered Glover and began to relentlessly, sadistically goad him. Fisher looked at this insecure, humiliated teenager in the eye and weaponized the homophobia he had spent months cultivating in the barracks. He asked Glover, "How could you call yourself a soldier? How could you call yourself a man?" when he just got his ass kicked by what Fisher calls a faggot. Fisher twisted Glover's bruised ego until it snapped. He relentlessly hammered home the idea that the entire platoon was laughing at him. He convinced Glover that the only way to win back his manhood, the only way to earn the respect of the barracks, was to wipe Barry out. And as the sun went down on Independence Day, Justin Fisher had successfully primed the weapon. Now all he had to do was point it. By 2 a.m. on July 5th, the 4th of July celebrations at Fort Campbell had finally burned themselves out. The barracks were dead quiet. The heat inside the cinder block walls was unbearable. The air was thick and stagnant. To try to find some relief, Barry had dragged his small green canvas army cot out of his room and set it up on the concrete breezeway, that open airway catwalk running along the 3rd floor of the barracks. He laid down in his gym shorts and t-shirt. He was exhausted, and he fell into a deep sleep. He had no idea that just a few feet away, on the other side of a thin door, his roommate was handing a teenager the execution weapon. Inside the room, the alcohol from the weekend was still flowing through Calvin Glover's system, but the drunken bravado had morphed into a dark, fixated rage. Justin Fisher had just spent the last 24 hours rewiring Glover's brain, convinced him that Barry was a threat to his manhood and an embarrassment to the infantry, and a target that needed to be eliminated. Fisher walks over to his own military locker. He opened the metal door. He bypassed his standard issue gear. He reached into the back and pulled out a wooden Louisville Slugger baseball bat. He turned around and handed it to the 18-year-old. Glover took the bat. He stepped out of the room and into that thick, humid night air on the breezeway. Barry was completely defenseless. He was asleep on his stomach, his face turned to the side. He didn't hear Glover approach. He didn't have a chance to defend himself, to reason with him, or to fight back like he did prior. Glover raised the Louisville Slugger, and with all that built-up insecurity, with the engineered hatred, and the drunken fury he could muster, he swung it down directly onto Barry's head. The first strike was catastrophic. It fractured Barry's skull instantly, but Glover didn't stop. He swung again, and again, and again. The violence was so extreme, so completely unhinged, that the impact drove the canvas cot downward, splattering blood across the concrete floor and up the cinder block walls of the breezeway. When the rage finally exhausted itself, Glover stood over the cot, gasping for air, holding the blood-soaked bat. Barry was unconscious, bleeding out rapidly into the Kentucky summer night. Glover turned around and walked back into the barracks room. He was covered in blood. And this is where you see the true, chilling psychopathy of Justin Fisher. Fisher hadn't swung the bat. He hadn't got a single drop of blood on his hands. But a panicked, blood-soaked teenager walked back into his room. Fisher didn't call for a medic. He didn't check on his roommate. He went into cover-up mode. Fisher took the bat away from Glover. He ordered the teenager to go back to the latrine, wash the blood off his hands, and clean up. Fisher then took a towel and began to frantically wipe down the murder weapon, trying to scrub away any evidence of the nightmare he just orchestrated. Outside on the breezeway, another soldier who had been sleeping nearby heard the wet, heavy sounds of the impact. He stepped out of his room to see what had happened and found Barry. The barracks erupted. Soldiers started pouring out of their rooms. A combat medic in the unit desperately tried to stabilize Barry while they waited for the medvac. The scene on the catwalk was horrifying. There was so much blood that the first responders eventually thought that Barry had been shot in the head with a high-caliber weapon. They life-flighted him to Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, the very city where he found a brief, shining moment of peace and love with Calpernia. The trauma surgeons did everything they could to relieve the swelling in his brain, but the damage was too severe. Private First Class Barry Winchell never regained consciousness. The following day, on July 6, his parents made the agonizing decision to remove him from life support. The murder of Barry Winchell was an unthinkable tragedy, but what happened in the hours, days, and weeks that followed was a profound, systematic betrayal. When a soldier is murdered on an army installation, the military machine kicks into gear immediately. The Criminal Investigation Command, or CID, takes over. But from the very second the sun came up on July 5th, the leadership at Fort Campbell didn't seem interested in finding the truth. They seemed interested in finding a narrative that protected the base. But the initial PR spin from the Army was completely sanitized. The base spokesperson released statements framing Barry's death as the result of a physical altercation, a drunken fight that had simply got out of hand over a holiday weekend. They completely erased the motive. They erased the months of relentless psychological torture, and most tellingly, they completely erased Calpernia Addams. The Army desperately wanted to avoid the words hate crime because admitting that a hate crime occurred would mean that admitting the culture of Fort Campbell had fostered it. But the cover up went farther and deeper than the press release. It was embedded in the chain of command. When investigators started interviewing the men in Barry's platoon, they hit a wall of silence and suddenly convened amnesia. The non-commissioned officers, the sergeants who lived and worked alongside Barry, the men whose entire job was to maintain order and protect their soldiers, suddenly claimed they had no idea Barry was being bullied. They testified they hadn't heard the slurs, they hadn't seen Justin Fisher's daily harassment. One sergeant even tried to claim that the morale in the unit was completely fine. It was a blatant, coordinated effort to protect the careers of the commanding officers, because under military law, if leadership knew about a hostile environment and failed to act, they were culpable. And the military might have gotten away with it if it hadn't been for Barry's parents, Wally and Patricia. They were grieving the brutal murder of their son, but they refused to be silenced by the Army's PR machine. They knew who Barry was, and they knew the military was lying. They quickly partnered with a powerful advocacy group called Service Members Legal Defense Network, or SLDN. The SLDN brought a massive, glaring spotlight to Fort Campbell. They bypassed the base internal command and went straight to the media, to Congress, and to the Pentagon. They provided evidence of the homophobic harassment. They brought Calpernia Addams' story to the forefront, showing that Barry wasn't killed over a drunken argument. He was killed for who he loved. The pressure became insurmountable. The Pentagon was forced to order the Army Inspector General to conduct a massive, overarching investigation into the climate at Fort Campbell. And what the Inspector General found completely shattered the Army's cover-up. The report confirmed that the harassment against Barry was pervasive, daily, and completely out in the open. It confirmed that the NCOs not only knew about it, but some of them had actually participated in the homophobic jokes. It proved that beyond the shadow of a doubt that the don't ask, don't tell policy hadn't protected Barry Winchell, it had gagged him, tied his hands, and served him up to his murderers. The base command was exposed. But while the Inspector General was writing reports, the two men who actually were responsible for the blood on the breezeway, they were about to head to a military courtroom. When the military justice system finally cornered the two men responsible for Barry's death, the trials were held at Fort Campbell under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. But if Barry's parents or anyone in the queer community were expecting a swift, righteous hammer of justice to fall down on both of them equally, they are about to be devastated all over again. The court-martial proceedings didn't just expose the brutal nature of the murder, they exposed the agonizing flaw in how the military assigns blame. Because in this courtroom, there was the blunt instrument and there was the puppet master, and the system treated them very, very differently. In December of 1999, 18-year-old Calvin Glover faced a court-martial for premeditated murder. His defense team knew they had an impossible uphill battle. The physical evidence was insurmountable. So they tried to pivot. They argued that Glover was highly impressionable, insecure, and his brain was completely marinated in alcohol that night. They pointed the finger directly at Justin Fisher, painting Fisher as a manipulative predator who had practically hypnotized Glover into committing the act. And honestly, they weren't entirely wrong about Fisher's role. But the military panel, they didn't care. Being manipulated doesn't change the fact that Glover walked out onto the breezeway, stood over a sleeping man, and swung a baseball bat until he destroyed a life. The panel deliberated just for a few hours. They found Private Calvin Glover guilty of premeditated murder. The 18-year-old broke down sobbing in the courtroom, and he was handed a sentence of life in military prison. along with the dishonorable discharge and forfeiture of all pay. But in the military justice system, a life sentence doesn't always mean that it's the rest of your natural life, because his sentence technically included the possibility of parole. Glover was eventually transferred out of the military prison custody and transferred into the federal prison system. And on August 27th, 2020, Calvin Glover was granted parole. He walked out of prison a free man. Also, fuck you, Calvin Glover. The weapon had been neutralized for a couple decades, sure. And the man who aimed him, well, his trial was next. Just a month later, in January 2000, Justin Fisher faced his own court martial. This is the man who stalked Barry's relationship, the man who orchestrated the daily homophobic harassment, the man who handed a drunk teenager a baseball bat, sent him out the door, and then scrubbed the blood off the weapon when the job was done. If there was ever a case for charging an accomplice with first-degree murder, this was it. But Justin Fisher was cunning, and the military prosecutors were looking for a guaranteed win without the messy optics of a highly publicized trial in barracks culture. Fisher's lawyers negotiated the plea deal. Instead of facing trial for murder, Justin Fisher pleaded guilty to a handful of lesser charges. He pleaded guilty to obstruction of justice for washing the blood off the bat. He pleaded guilty to lying to criminal investigators, and in a detail that almost feels like a sick joke, he pleaded guilty to providing alcohol to a minor, since Glover was only 18. When the sentence was read, Barry's mother, Patricia, was physically sickened. The disparity was staggering. The kid who was manipulated into swinging the bat got life, but the sociopath who engineered the entire nightmare was handed a definitive release date. And it gets worse. Because of good behavior and the mechanics of the military parole, Justin Fisher didn't even serve that in full sentence. He was quietly released from military prison in 2006. He served just 7 years. Fuck Justin Fisher. That's all I've got to say. Fuck him with something hard and sandpapery. 7 years for setting the trap, pulling the strings, and covering the tracks of a murder that changed the course of military history. When the gavel fell and Justin Fisher walked away with a slap on the wrist, the military brass probably hoped that the Barry Winchell story would quietly fade away. They hoped the media would move on and Fort Campbell could go back to business as usual. They drastically underestimated Barry's parents, and they underestimated Calpernia Addams. Barry's parents, Wally and Patricia, were paralyzed by grief, but they refused to be silenced. They took that grief and they forged it into an absolute weapon against the Pentagon. Partnering with the Service Members Legal Defense Network, they went on a relentless media campaign. They sat for interviews, they spoke to Congress, and they forced the American public to look directly at the rotting core of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Up until 1999, the debate around Don't Ask, Don't Tell was mostly political theory. Politicians argued about unit cohesion and privacy. But Barry's murder shattered that illusion. His death provided undeniable bloodstained proof that Don't Ask, Don't Tell provided no one with privacy. It only protected the abusers. It provided that forcing soldiers into the closet created a lethal environment where NCOs could look the other way while the soldier was literally being hunted in the barracks. Barry Winchell became the catalyst. His name became the rallying cry for the LGBT plus community in the military to seek equality. And then there was Calpernia. Calpernia Addams lost the man that she loved in the most horrific way imaginable. But instead of retreating into the shadows, she stepped directly into the light. She became a fierce, highly visible advocate for transgender rights and military reform. She refused to let the military erase her relationship with Barry to make their proceedings more palatable. In 2003, their story broke through the mainstream media in a massive way. Showtime released a film called Soldier's Girl. It starred Troy Garrity as Barry and Lee Pace as Calpernia. It was a beautiful, devastating, and unflinching look at their romance and the creeping horror of the barracks culture that destroyed it. Soldier's Girl did something incredible. It humanized the headline. It showed the American public that it wasn't just a political talking point about the military policy. It was a 21-year-old kid from Missouri who loved a showgirl in Nashville and who was bludgeoned to death in his sleep because of it. The film was nominated for multiple Golden Globes and Emmy Awards, and it cemented Barry and Calpernia's story in the cultural conscious. The military couldn't hide behind a PR spin anymore. The entire world was watching, and it would take another decade of ruling activism for Don't Ask, Don't Tell to finally be repealed. The foundation of the policy began to crumble the night that Barry Winchell died. When you spend as much time researching the dark side of humanity as I do, you develop a certain kind of armor. You have to. But every now and then, a case slips right past the armor and sits heavy in your chest. This one did that for me. Maybe it's because Barry and I are so close in age. He was just a year older than I am. When I think about 1999, I know exactly where I was, what I was listening to, and who I was trying to be. And to look at a guy like Barry, an 80s kid who just wanted to fly helicopters and live his life, it hits a little too close to home. Right out of high school, I actually considered the military. I went through the initial motions, thinking it might be the right path. But my resting heart rate was too rapid, and I was disqualified. At the time, I was disappointed, but looking back now at the suffocating, toxic climate of the military in the late 90s under Don't Ask, Don't Tell, especially being a guy that doesn't fit that rigid hypermasculinity mold, the rapid heart rate might have been the best thing that ever happened to me. And now, as I'm recording, this is the 4th of July weekend. There will be barbecues, cold beer, and fireworks lighting up the sky in celebration of independence, of freedom. But as you look up those lights, just take a second to remember. A 21-year-old soldier who volunteered his life to defend those freedoms only realized the most dangerous place he could be was in his own bed, surrounded by his brothers in arms. Freedom is just about what country you live in. It's about having the right to exist, exactly as you are, without a target on your back. Thank you for listening to this episode of Homocidal Tendency. Make sure you're subscribed, leave a rating, and check out our socials. Until next time, keep the lights on, keep your head on a swivel, and remember, monsters don't take holidays off. I'll see you next time.